focusing on modern Britain from 1900 to now, and we're going to be looking at living conditions. So let's start by looking at housing, because this is the main living condition that we need to look at for modern period. So housing in 1900. Britain's most poorest families are still living in unhealthy conditions. The worst housing conditions were found in the terrace streets of back-to-back housing, who were rented by private landlords. And as you can see, we mentioned in the industrial period, there's no green areas, okay, because they're back-to-back, there's a lack of ventilation and often led to dirty, damp conditions and illnesses such as pneumonia. So, step one, we need to start improving housing because it's not working for us in Britain. So 1909, governments begin to take more responsibility for people's health and they began tackling the housing problem. So in 1909, Parliament banned any new back-to-back housing. So they were no longer allowed to build this type of housing. Private landowners and builders grumbled at this, as you can imagine, because it's cheap, but it did lead to an improvement of housing. So we've got the 1909 Housing Act led to the end of back-to-back housing. Okay, so we move on to an act 10 years later. So Parliament's Housing Act in 1919, because of the conditions, they ordered councils to build new rented housing for people to live, for those people living in poverty, okay, because the conditions were so poor, they needed new houses. They used taxpayers' money to fund this, and these houses had to have a water supply, okay, to the houses and drainage. So, when World War I happened in 1914, these council houses that were created were called, and this is why the Act was 1919, because it was following World War I. These council houses that were made were sometimes called homes fit for heroes. Okay, the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, promised to build a country fit for heroes when they returned from war. So they were promised these houses, and here's an image of a catalogue showing that. So the Housing Act, we've got a slow improvement. So now we've got no back-to-back housing and we've got new houses being built for people coming back from the war. Now we've got the 1930 Housing Act, so another 10 or so years later. Despite such developments, the worst slums still remain. So even though they were building these houses for war heroes, the slums, the awful housing still remained. The government could see that landlords were not going to build houses for them. Okay, they'd rather have other tenants. So in 1913, they passed another Housing Act. Okay, it's time to clear the slums. This forced landlords to sell their houses to poor people so they could clear the slums. So that's the end of the slums. 1930s Housing Act said that it was the end of the slums. Okay, so following World War II, and as we know because we've been studying that, in 1945, city councils wanted to build as many homes as they could in the land they bought. The development of gas and electric heaters meant that households no longer needed to have access to a store or move coal. This allowed local authorities to start building low-rise blocks of flats, 3 or 4 stories high. Now it's really important because after World War II there was 475,000 homes in Britain that were destroyed because of the war. Therefore, council houses needed to be built to house these people. There's too many people, we didn't have enough council houses. At first they were built as just normal houses, but following on into the 1970s, governments offered generous amounts of money to build large blocks of flats. So builders obviously took that incentive, and this is why you can see all over Britain all of these what we call streets in the air, the first really large block of flats that could house lots and lots of people. Okay, so 4,500 new blocks just like this were built by 1980. Now you might think that was a good thing. Many people hated living in these flats, or still do to some extent, because they're not having a garden or an access to community. Okay, but it did somewhat solve the housing problem. Okay, so we move towards the the later part of this period to 1918, we look at the decline of council housing. So we know they built all the council houses to house people after the war, but by 1979, 42% of the population lived in a council house compared to 1%. So nearly half of the population are living in these council houses, okay, council owned. The Conservative Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, which I'm sure you've all heard about, was frustrated, okay, and she thought this had gone too far. We needed to do something about it. Too many people were living off the government. She believed people would be less dependent on the state, the government, if they owned their own house. So, in 1980, she passed a Housing Act, okay, the last of the housing acts that you need to know about, which gave tenants, that's people living in the house, the right to buy the house they're living in. This led councils to have fewer houses, okay, because they were now privately owned. The council didn't own them anymore, and that left people who needed shelter without a home. So this caused quite a big problem. Also, the government had put restrictions on council spending, so the budget was really small. So there was people who didn't have a house and they didn't have enough money, the government, to build more houses. As well as this, landlords, people who own houses, took advantage of this because they know people would need to rent houses, and they increased the rent. Okay, so that was a little bit of a problem. So let's summarise then. Turning point, impact on housing. Turning point was First World War. Okay, government took responsibility for public housing for the first time. 50% of promised homes were built, okay, 500,000. The 1930 Housing Act led to final slum clearances. We've got the end of slums and government taking responsibility. However, this was quite slow progress. Then we've got the Second World War, and we've got the building of cheap high-rise accommodation, so streets in the sky with gas and electric, which people were pleased about. However, high-rises destroyed the community spirit. And then we've got later on another impact, the government of Thatcher. So people were encouraged to buy their own council houses. However, local councils could not replace the houses sold. This encouraged more private landlords, some of whom rented poor quality accommodation, which affected health. So just make sure you've got those notes down. Housing is the most important living condition in terms of change over time in the modern period. So let's quickly, we've got a little bit left, let's quickly look at food, okay, during this period. So let's start at the beginning, okay, when we look at the First World War and the Second World War. During the Second World War, imports, that's food coming into the country, fell. We didn't have enough food coming into the country. So it was rationed. So what everyone was given was a ration book, and that people were only allowed a certain amount of food a week. People were encouraged to grow their own food. Okay, here you can see, if you dig for victory now, grow their own food and keep animals. Rationing controlled the amount of food and improved people's health. So people were eating fairly healthily here, but they weren't eating an awful lot. Okay, so that's food at the beginning. Then we move on later in this period, and we've got technology. So refrigeration and canning, so preserving foods in cans, improved supply and made food cheaper. So now we've got the introduction of a refrigerator. You can keep your food for longer, which meant we could keep food at a cheaper cost. Home refrigerators allow people to keep food for longer, and microwave ovens led to convenience food becoming popular. This is the start of almost fast food. Okay, not having to wait for the oven to cook thoroughly. Microwave can do it in minutes. So I'll recap that. We've got the rationing at the beginning of war. We've got the introduction of technology. And also, after 1950, people became richer and could afford new technology. The impact of immigration, okay, more people coming into our country from different countries brought their cultures with it. So people started for the first time to eat Chinese takeaways, Indian takeaways. And then the last one, because we don't talk about water and waste, well, the last two, should we say, because water and waste has obviously been improved thanks to the work of John Snow and Joseph Bazalgette in the previous period. So we're going to look at air, because there was a problem with air at the time. So, as you know, people were still continuing to burn lots of fuels, lots of coal, and this led to the smog. Okay, in the first part of the 20th century, smog, which is smoke and fog, in the big industrial cities like London, from factories were causing lung conditions such as pneumonia. So nothing's changed here. We've still got a problem with the air. So during Queen Elizabeth's reign, the Queen that's just died, Okay, the Clean Air Act was created of 1956, which made people burn smokeless fuels, okay, reducing the amount of smoke in the air. This created smoke-free zones, which helped to get rid of smog and helped to stop things like pneumonia. However, after 1980, a huge increase in car ownership, okay, has led to an increase in air pollution. So if you look at it today, most families have between 1 and 2 cars, and that is obviously polluting our environment. Okay, we're working hard to combat that when you see things like electric cars coming in. And last but not least, another living condition which is affecting people is inactivity. So that means not doing physical exercise or doing anything physical. So from 1980 to now, really, labour-saving devices such as cars, televisions and computers have all led to people being more inactive. So during the war and after the war, people were much more active. They walked to their jobs, okay, their social and leisure activities, as mentioned in the previous video, were more active. Now, unfortunately, we spend a lot of time on devices, listening to music, sitting on the sofa, playing with our devices rather than going outside. And that is having an impact on our physical health. So in 1980s, Britain faced a series of food scares. Okay, one of the main ones that you will have seen is the amount of sugar that we consume and fast food today and the effect that that is having, particularly on children's health. So that's an issue that we are still dealing with today. So, exam questions. What sort of exam questions might you get asked? Well, here are a few. If you've got some time, I'd have a go at thinking about what you would answer to these questions. These two are essentially the same. So write a clear and organised summary that analyses living conditions since 1900s. Okay, when it says people's lifestyle, that's the same as living conditions. And then you've got 18 markers such as advances in public health in 1900 have mainly been because of the actions to improve housing. How far do you agree? So if you've got time, try and answer those. If not, you need to make sure you answer these 7 questions just to check you've been listening to the video.